Welcome to Invested in Climate. Protecting the planet and decarbonizing the global economy is the challenge of our time. We all have a role to play, and the opportunity we face is unprecedented. Invested in Climate aims to help people do more to address climate change through their work, investment, lifestyle, and activism. I'm your host, Jason Rissman. I support a growing community of top climate and ESG leaders as the Chief Experience Officer at Nationswell, and I'm an advisor to the climate practice at IDEO. I'm also an investor and startup advisor, and when it comes to climate action, I know I'll be a lifelong learner, always looking to have more impact. If you like what you hear, give us a good rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you found us. Sign up for updates and suggest ideas for future episodes at investedinclimate.com. Follow us on social, subscribe, and spread the word. Thanks for joining.
Defining the adaptation solution set is very difficult. It's kind of a catch-all term for what do we need to survive? And that, I think, is where the alarm bells are going off.
Hey everyone, we know that addressing climate change will take trillions of dollars of investment. According to the Climate Policy Institute, we'll need to spend over $10 trillion annually for decades. And we only just exceeded $1 trillion for the first time in 2022. I'll confess, these big numbers for me are hard to conceptualize, and I'm always glad for more nuanced ways to break them down. That's why when I saw Oxford's Climate Tech Initiative's recent report, I reached out to one of its authors, Jamil Wyne. The Oxford report builds on recent climate finance data by asking almost 150 climate investors, entrepreneurs, and policymakers around the world what they're seeing. It's a snapshot from inside climate tech that identifies gaps, promising opportunities, and 5 recommended changes for climate finance. In this interview, Jamil and I cover all that and more. We go beyond just talking about the numbers, and I think you'll appreciate the global perspective and ability to zoom in and out that both Jamil and the Oxford report bring. Enjoy. Hey Jamil, welcome back to Invested in Climate, and congratulations for being the first guest to make a return appearance.
Thanks so much, Jason. It was awesome to be here the first time, and really glad you reached out again to invite me back. So excited for this.
Well, it's great to have you back and get to catch up. You certainly keep busy, and I see that you're contributing to advancing climate tech and climate finance in several ways. And when I saw that you and a team at Oxford published an impressively comprehensive report on the state of climate tech, I knew it'd be something worth hearing about. But first, set the stage for us. Tell us a bit about your own portfolio of projects and what's been energizing to you lately.
In terms of the report, I think we've been really fortunate with the reception that we've received, and both media outlets as well as financial institutions and governments and similar entities that are working on these issues have been interested in learning from us and getting our input. And so on one hand, it's just been really gratifying to get the message out there, or messages out there. And then in parallel to that, work we're doing with the boot camp and Riffle, as well as some independent advisory that I'm doing, I think it's been really helpful to give us a more complete picture around what the climate tech and climate investment story is, not just in the US, but elsewhere. For me, I think a lot of the energy comes from being able not just to use the research and the work that we do and show that there's something that people can benefit from by virtue of reading it, but also it's like this constant learning journey, right? Where there's never really, I think, a point where you can feel satisfied with your knowledge on like climate and climate tech. It's something that's like evolving very quickly, and it manifests itself in different ways all around the world. And so we get a lot of energy, I think, also just from being out in the market and traveling and experiencing the different ways people are using it. So get a lot of energy from that. As an introvert, though, I need to probably spend a little bit more time on my own, but very enjoying what we've been up to so far.
That's great. Well, we'll make sure to circle back and hear more about the other initiatives, but let's get started with unpacking the Climate Tech Opportunity Report published by the Oxford Climate Tech Initiative late last year. Give us a sense of how did the report get started and what was it aiming to add to a landscape of climate tech reporting where there's already a lot that's out there?
Sure. Very fortunate to have some awesome colleagues at Said Business School that were interested in the same types of questions and topics that I was when it came to climate tech. The team was really sensitive to the fact that there's ways that climate is experienced and ways that climate tech needs to be implemented that aren't necessarily getting discussed, meaning A lot of the funding comes from the US, EU, and China, whether you're looking at it from a venture capital lens or in finance, at finance writ large. And so because of that, there's a lot of other countries that aren't necessarily participating, you could say, in the same way. Many of them have been very small contributors to overall GHG emissions. Those same countries oftentimes are quite vulnerable. And so where I'm going with this is that we wanted to expand the lens a little bit around when we think and try to work on climate tech initiatives, kind of whose voices are we hearing? Are the questions that we're asking in countries like the US relevant for countries that are not necessarily as well endowed resource wise as we are? A lot of our motivation was to start getting a better understanding of what kind of the non-usual suspects are thinking about. But at the same time, we saw it as a really good opportunity to start putting a little bit of kind of numbers clarity around where the field could be going in general. And so, the first half of the report was very focused on kind of being a standard kind of market intelligence piece that you might see elsewhere. But at the same time, we tried to complement it by going in depth in a certain number of areas that we felt don't necessarily get the same amount of airtime, like adaptation, vulnerable populations, talent, et cetera. So hopefully it's a bit more of a comprehensive picture.
Great. Well, definitely appreciate that you've taken a more inclusive approach and made sure to hear the unusual suspects. Let's hear some of the basics. Tell us a bit about just where climate tech investing is at, how it's grown over the last 10 years, and how much capital is being deployed, how many investors are involved, and the growth that we've seen.
It can be a little bit tricky to put a wrapper around the whole sector, but we used numbers from PwC and Climate Policy Initiative. And the way that I think they kind of quantify the numbers is around both the distribution geographically, distribution in terms of sectors, and the types of capital. And so if you look at it from a VC lens, I think over the past like 10 to 15 years, we've seen over 100 billion go into climate tech. PwC identified around 6,000 unique investors, over 3,000 individual investments. A lot of the VC funding, as you know, goes into transportation and energy, built environment, heavy industry, agriculture are also big emitters, but they're not necessarily funded as heavily just yet. When you expand that lens to look at other types of funding, so debt, grants, et cetera, where you're going to see more public sector involvement, this is where, groups like CPI do a really wonderful job of trying to quantify what the kind of aggregate levels of global climate finance look like. Last year, according to CPI, we first, as we've never done before, crossed that $1 trillion threshold for the number of dollars that have gone out the door. The last I looked at it was about 52% came from governments, a little under 50% came from private sector. A lot of that's in the form of debt. And then I think a lot of that also is distributed geographically. Climate VC has primarily been allocated from US, EU, China, a little bit from India. So it's really confined to a few number of countries. And because it's the source of the capital is oftentimes confined to the geography that those funds are domiciled in. So you don't necessarily see, US funds investing in Kenyan climate tech startups, right? Or Pakistani climate tech startups, right? However, climate finance has, I think, a far further reach. It goes into more geographies. There's a lot of underfunded geographies and sectors, but it has, I think, a larger footprint than the VC space. So it can be a little bit challenging sometimes to disentangle the two because they kind of follow each other in certain ways, but then they start to deviate in other areas, which we can dig into a little bit more in the conversation.
Jamil, tell us why it's important. Some people say that we already have most of the technology we need, and it's just a question of deploying and scaling what we have. Is that true?
For 2030 targets, the IEA has said that, and this is decarbonization rather than adaptation and resilience, they said that decarbonization would require kind of a solution set of tech of which we've got probably 70% already. So as you said, a lot of that is already built and getting pushed into the market. Around 30% has yet to be made or is in development. So it hasn't necessarily been commercialized or getting built and sold at scale. If you kind of look a little bit further down the line to hitting 2050 targets, I think it looks a slightly more even split between tech that already exists and is in the market and tech that still needs to be created. In one hand, that means that there's still a lot of innovation that has to happen. At the same time, as you said, we are now talking a lot more about implementing, not just having things that function in a lab or in a pilot, but things that can work across entire cities, countries, industries, et cetera. So I think you're right. In one extent, a lot of solutions are there, but will they get implemented quickly? And will they do so at scale? And will they reach everybody? Those are big questions that I don't know if anybody's got the answer for yet.
Yeah, and let's be clear, I wasn't saying that we are there, but some people do make the argument that it's not about developing new technology. And I think it's important to ask the question. Let's talk about where the funding is actually going. The report discusses a mismatch between the industries which need investment and those that are actually attracting the most capital. And this is data from PwC and the Climate Policy Institute. Let's talk about that mismatch. Over 50% of climate finance in aggregate from all sources goes to energy, followed by transportation, which gets 25%. These two sectors together receive over 75% of total investment. And it's a mismatch because those two sectors together account for just about 25% of emissions. And so a question is this mismatch clearly a bad thing, or might these sectors simply be more capital intensive and require more investment?
We tried to stay away from labeling it as a positive or a negative, and more so just saying, as you said, there's a mismatch. And I think there's a couple nuanced ways of looking at it. So on one hand, you can think of it as like a resounding positive, right? Because say 5, 10 years ago, we were nowhere close to those types of figures, right? I don't know what the numbers were off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that they were a fraction of what we were seeing now, right? And if you also think about, we always talk about clean tech 101 or 1.0 and the bust that was associated with it or came from it. So for us to kind of rebound as investors and entrepreneurs, so to speak, I think that's very, very encouraging. And there's a lot of people that need to be commended, right? So getting those numbers to that level should not be seen as a bad thing per se, right? I know that's not what you're saying, but just like in case anybody was reading the mismatch and saying, we're missing our target or we're taking the easy way out here by investing in the things that we understand better, like we're going to have to start somewhere, right? And the fact that we're deploying this much with the lingering fears of the clean tech bust from a decade ago, I think that's something to be celebrated. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're investing too much in those sectors. It could also mean that we're not investing anywhere enough in the other sectors, right? So it reminds me a little bit of the conversation that people have around mitigation and adaptation funding, where we say that we are not investing anywhere enough in adaptation, which I think is completely true. And it's so lopsided, it almost feels like sometimes we're not investing in adaptation at all. But that doesn't mean that we're investing enough in mitigation either, right? It just means that, relatively speaking, the two are quite lopsided.
So, Jamil, switching from total investment to focusing instead just on venture capital, over 60% of venture capital has gone to transportation, and energy falls to the third ranking segment. Break this down for us. Why are venture investors so enamored with transportation, and what are they investing in? How much of that is electric vehicles, and what else are they investing in?
I can provide a couple insights into some of like the different thematic areas that are receiving more investment. And I think those are also indicative of what the story around transportation is right now. So I think transportation very much sits in that category of, well, we've got a lot of the technology now, it's about deploying and implementing. So it's not necessarily as much about, do we know how to build EVs or do we know how to build batteries and how do we get the lithium, et cetera. I think we have a pretty good understanding of what's needed to be done in order to get these things into the market. And we already are, right? I think Tesla obviously signified to consumers globally that transportation and you as a consumer owning a car have agency, right? And it, in a lot of ways, kind of put some responsibility in the consumer's hand. It's very tangible, right? We also have a legacy of investing in transportation in the VC space, right? So Uber, Lyft, we have countless like versions of those. I used to work a lot in the Middle East. Kareem, that was acquired by Uber a few years ago. People know that model. They're comfortable with it. They understand how to sell to governments. They understand how to get it in the hands of consumers, I think, a lot better than the other sectors. And so that's why I would say transportation has been able to get at least a little bit more excitement and energy and obviously resources. In terms of where the capital goes, I mean, I think it's across the board, right? I think you see a lot of people now both deploying into the kind of hardware that's needed, right? So better battery storage is a great example of that, right? More efficient batteries, et cetera. But at the same time, now that these technologies are out in the market, right? I mean, on a regular basis, you'll bump into a Tesla or another type of EV. We need to build the infrastructure surrounding that, right? Which means everything from the hardware to the software that's monitoring its usage. I think that is because the ecosystem is a lot clearer to people now, right? We understand that the universe that surrounds an EV has a lot of different like touch points and intersections, et cetera. We can more clearly develop a business case and an investment thesis around it. So I think that's also helped to shape the narrative in people's minds and attracted capital.
Great. Thanks, Jamil. So back to the mismatch. From an emission standpoint, where are we underinvesting? And you mentioned a bit, and we'll go back to the difference in investing in mitigation versus adaptation. But from a sectoral lens, what sectors are being neglected?
Two ways to answer that question, or sorry, maybe two parts. First part would be heavy industry, the built environment, these types of areas, right? So a few years ago, I think people who would say decarbonized steel or decarbonized cement, I don't know if that really registered in the average investor's or like the average entrepreneur or consumer's mind. And I think only in the past few years have we started to see a lot of these ideas move from like the lab into the market, right? On one hand, I think they're just underfunded because the innovations around them are a little bit younger, or they've spent more time being developed and getting ready for the market. And now we can put kind of a look and feel and a story around them, and you can develop a business case. The other side of the story, which is a little bit more concerning in my mind, is that, that graph just looks at the big emitting sectors. It doesn't acknowledge adaptation needs. We didn't include it because defining the adaptation solution set is very difficult. It's kind of a catch-all term for what do we need to survive. And that, I think, is where the alarm bells are going off in people's minds. It was hard at first for people to wrap their heads around the need. But I think once people started realizing that we're looking at a warming world for the foreseeable future, you start to wonder, no matter how much of a green transition, meaning EV adoption, renewables, decarbonizing the built environment, no matter how much we achieve on that front, the earth will still get hotter and all sorts of problems emanate from that. We have to start now thinking, well, yes, we've underfunded adaptation, but how do you incentivize people to change that? And how do you build a solution set that's representative of people's needs? Because the mitigation solution set, if you think about it, is kind of confined to a few specific verticals, relatively speaking. And there's a North Star there. It's GHG removal or reduction. Mitigation, it's does society continue to survive, right? And that's a much larger set of needs, both tech as well as policy, as well as human behavior, and the list goes on.
Thanks, Jamil. Meaty conversation there for sure about all the tech, policy, and behavior change required to adapt to climate change, which we'll talk more about in a bit. First, let's talk about the report's sectoral deep dives, as I think they're really illuminating. You asked almost 150 climate tech investors, entrepreneurs, and policymakers about the most promising opportunities within different climate tech spaces. We don't have time to go through them all, but let's pick one to get a sense of what you're able to surface. And let's focus on energy. What do people see as the best investment opportunities within the energy sector, according to those that you talk to?
Energy storage and grid management were seen as the top two kind of verticals within the energy space. And in my mind, if I were to kind of take a step back and say, what does that tell us? I think it means, on one hand, that the source of energy, right? So whether you're thinking about solar, hydro, wind, geothermal, et cetera, we have a pretty good understanding of how to get it. We have a pretty good understanding now of how to create that energy. But then what do you do with it in a way that is sustainable, well managed, efficiently used, monitored, et cetera? So when you move into things like the storage element and the grid management, right, you're almost talking about kind of managing the ecosystem of players that surrounds energy usage and like distribution and consumption. On one hand, I think it reflects the maturity of the sector, because we're not saying any longer, well, how do you create clean energy, right? We're way past that point. It's more, how do you distribute it quickly? How do you conserve it when you're not using it? So it becomes almost like a deployment and management issue, which is, again, a sign of progress.
Thanks, Jamil. As you said, we don't have time to go through all the sector deep dives, but I'm curious, what else stood out to you? Were there any surprises?
So one of the surprises for us was when we were looking at carbon capture and carbon removal technologies. I was expecting people to say direct air capture by a long shot as the most promising vertical to invest in. And it wasn't. It actually sat a little bit lower on the list. The one that people were most frequently pointing to, and again, this could just be by virtue of who we surveyed and who we interviewed, but it was rehabilitation of natural ecosystems and using nature-based solutions as a way to capture carbon and GHGs. And I think, again, that reflects a certain inflection point that we're at, where a few years ago, it wasn't so much that we weren't talking about nature's role in regulating the environment. We've been saying that for decades. However, I don't know if in the investment community was thinking about nature as a target for its investment dollars. So I was very pleasantly surprised that actually nature-based solutions, when we were talking to a predominantly tech-focused community, tech and VC-focused community, a lot of people raised their hands, right, when they said that this is an attractive vertical. And so that was one that jumped out at me.
Great. Jamil, your report also includes 5 recommendations for moving forward. And I often ask guests what needs to change to better address climate change. So I really appreciated this section of the report. You did the work for me. Walk us quickly through those 5 recommendations. The first is about growing the amount as well as the type of funding for climate tech. Tell us more.
Absolutely. So think of it this way. We have to deploy, by all accounts, several $trillion a year. And that number goes up annually, right? So if you start thinking about what we need when it comes to the next decade and what we're going to be requiring on an annual basis in 2030 onwards, people are saying things like $9 to $10 trillion a year, right? And so even though at the beginning of this conversation, I said, well, we've hit these great milestones. We crossed $1 trillion in aggregate climate finance and over $100 billion was invested in climate tech VC globally over the past decade. That still pales in comparison to where we need to be. So on one hand, you ask anybody what the story around finance is, most likely they'll first say, we need a lot more of it. The other thing is when we think about what the full spectrum of needs is, venture capital obviously has a certain role to play on financing riskier technologies. But at the same time, as you said earlier, as we move into the implementation and deployment of those, VC isn't necessarily going to be the main instrument we're using, right? So project finance and debt, for instance, are things that we're going to have to be leveraging a lot more, which operates very differently than the VC space, right? They don't take a spray and pray approach. They take a much more conservative strategy when they invest. They look for very, very steady cash flows, dependable assets that they know are going to return in their investment, right? So it's a very different mindset. The other thing is that I think we're learning slowly too that we can't necessarily assign an ROI to everything that needs climate funding. If you think about the number of climate migrants that are going to be, well, already are on Earth, and I think the tens of millions, if not billions, that are going to appear over the next several decades, when you think about the resources that they're going to need to survive, that's not a role necessarily for returns-oriented capital. I mean, there is a role for some, but if they need humanitarian aid and assistance, which I think aren't necessarily captured always in climate finance numbers, that's not something that we're really equipped to do, I think, at the moment. I think that also gets into expanding the pool of dollars, but also the types of funding and also the mindset that we're using as we deploy.
Jamil, the next recommendation is about the role of governments and corporations, that supporting climate is not just about private investors, but they have a role to play as well. What is it that governments need to be doing more of?
It's tough to say across the board what like the prototypical kind of set of government actions is, right? And I say that because some governments are overseeing countries or regulating, taking care of countries that are massive emitters. And so on one hand, the narrative and the strategy that those countries are going to be using just fundamentally will look different than one that is maybe been more so on the receiving end of decades of emissions that have created existential threats to their survival, right? So like what the US government's approach is going to look very, very different than, say, what the Marshall Islands is going to have. Those are kind of extreme examples here, but I use it just to color that there's a range of strategies. If we think about it, though, from the US government's angle, I would break it into 3 categories. So first is it has to decarbonize itself, right? Like the US government is an enormous emitter, right? The Department of Defense, for instance, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but if you think about both the personnel, the machinery, the procurement power they have, the supply chains activity, they're basically a global corporation, right? That's just one entity within the government. Then the government also has to think about, well, how do we protect our people? Again, taking the US government lens, like we have bases in low-lying island nations that are at high risk of even a slight increase in sea levels can destabilize the entire island, which means that you introduce national security threats. The second role after decarbonizing is protecting. They have to fundamentally take care of their people. And climate risk will look maybe different from country to country, but the government is there fundamentally to take care of its population. And the last is obviously like enable the uptake of new technologies, enable more finance to flow into them. And I think that's particularly true for big governments like the US, because if you look at something like the IRA, it's a great example of the government's role to kind of start to reshape the way that markets function, and as well as reshape consumer and investor behavior. So I would think of those three buckets as like typically the way that a government needs to operate, which puts them in a very unique position. We put government and corporations kind of in the same bucket because they're these big entities, but corporations do have their own, I think, set of measures they have to take, but it's not identical.
Great. Recommendation number 3 is about talent and workforce. That is to create national strategies to build the talent pools for climate tech. Is this not already happening? Everyone I know is looking for roles in climate tech.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that on one hand, we are seeing a historically high number of people say, I'm either going to transition into climate or I want to learn about it and how it affects my day job so that I can better prepare myself for it. So you're right. On one hand, that's a milestone, I think, that we're crossing, at least here in the US. And I think you could say that in EU as well. I think there's an uptick in interest in working on climate. That, I think, though, in my mind, is largely around like kind of higher paying jobs, maybe more like white collar labor. There's a blue collar labor here that we're going to need in such vast quantities. People that are installing, maintaining, and these aren't necessarily low paying jobs either. I mean, I said kind of higher paying jobs at the beginning of the answer, but I do think that these are also jobs that can command very steady and good incomes for people. And they will need to be credentialed in order to do that, right? So you've probably heard about the need to get more people that know how to install and maintain heat pumps, right? And that's just one specific product. We didn't include this in much detail in the report, but one of the interviews that we did was with an individual who specializes in labor needed specifically for green energy projects. And he was saying that in the US, the Department of Labor doesn't actually have any type of taxonomy for green jobs, right? So if you think about it, one reason why I think so many of us are saying, I'm interested in climate, and where do I go to find a job? It's kind of indicative of the fact that we haven't built out those pathways yet. And the other thing, too, I think, is that we, again, are kind of seeing this from a US lens when we say a lot of the talent is there and a lot of the energy is kind of flowing from a human capital standpoint into climate. I think that reflects the mindset that our country is in right now, that climate is a challenge we can tackle with our human capital and our resources. I don't think it's necessarily the same story that people are saying in other countries, which is important to keep in mind. It didn't show up in the final report, but I do remember one individual that we interviewed who was a venture capital investor focusing on climate in sub-Saharan Africa. He was like, look, saying that you work on climate here is not considered cool or interesting, right? It's a very different way that we think about it. It's not our highest priority right now. We're more concerned with job creation, right? Because we have such mass unemployment. The optimist in me says, well, as you go through a green transition, you will create more jobs. However, that's not the way that the people on the ground are experiencing it.
Jamil, what I loved about your insights and your examples is that you provided a US example as well as something for the international context. And I think that's part of the breadth and what's so exciting about this report. It applies also to the 4th recommendation, which is about focusing solutions on communities most impacted by climate change. So, of course, this is both within the US and other Western countries, but also for everywhere in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the one I think, if I were to say the part of the report that we enjoyed putting together the most, I think it was that, because it's not getting, in my mind, anywhere as much of attention as it should be. Defining what is vulnerable or who is vulnerable is a little bit tricky when it comes to climate, right? So I use the example of the Marshall Islands. I mean, the UN has already said that there's 9 to 10 countries that could physically disappear just because of the rising sea levels, and those are low-lying island nations, right? So that is a vulnerable population in one mind, right? At the same time, people that are working in an agriculture sector in a country that is dealing with vast water scarcity. So I'm doing a project in Morocco right now. And last March, they lost somewhere between 200 to 300,000 jobs in their agriculture sector alone, right? I mean, that's an enormous amount of jobs lost in a country that's very vulnerable already. Vulnerability is both, I think, how quickly or how directly in line you are with a climate risk, but also how easily can you recover once that risk starts to actually affect you. I sit on a climate resilience committee at the International Rescue Committee. And one of my colleagues there, she made this very, very interesting point. She was like, most people, when we talk about adaptation, think building seawalls, more advanced weather forecasting. If you're a really vulnerable population, your adaptation strategy might be leaving your home. And that is going to affect tens of millions, if not hundreds. Some people have said over 1 billion climate migrants are going to be expected. And that also applies to the US, right? We talk about, and I'm from the Appalachian area. The Appalachian area will be a receiver of a lot of people coming up from the South. The Appalachian area is not built to receive people, right? It's not necessarily across the board an affluent, very easily integrated into, just like any city would be very difficult to integrate that number of people into. And so the vulnerability issue, I think, it was reassuring in the sense that a lot of people agreed that it needs to be addressed. But at the same time, if you look at it from the other angle, it's quite alarming because we've all kind of agreed that we've missed the mark so far in addressing it.
Yeah, and migration not just happening internally domestically, but imagine increasing the number of migrants to the US by 10x, which most people think is very likely as a result of climate disruption. This brings us to the last recommendation, which is about adaptation. So set the stage for us because, Jamil, this is something that you've already brought up. And I think you made the comment that there's barely any funding that goes to adaptation, at least relative to mitigation. So give us a sense, how much funding actually does go to adaptation?
So if you look at all climate finance globally, I think it's around 5 to 7% as of last year went into adaptation, which means obviously around 95 to 93% went into mitigation. It's also important to acknowledge that we probably need a lot more to go into mitigation still, right? We're still way, way below that mark. But it also means that we have to rapidly increase adaptation. The reason why it's important, not to say that there's only one single reason, but the narrative, I think, for me is we are looking at a warming planet for probably decades to come at least. And we need to be able to, for lack of a better word, adapt to it, right? So how do we get water? How do we eat food, nutritious food as well, right? How do we stay healthy, right? How do we predict when these more extreme weather events are going to hit us, right? If we have to leave our homes, where do we go, right? Our cities built to absorb, as you said, a 10x on the US, right? Yes, like we have a history of welcoming migrants from abroad, but 10x is a significant number that nobody is built to absorb, really. Adaptation is this huge set of questions, right? That even if we went through a 100% green transition tomorrow, we would still have to figure out how do we navigate a planet that is fundamentally changed and potentially forever in some ways. I think with the adaptation bit, as I said earlier, we don't necessarily have a key metric of success of like, what does adapting to a warming planet really look like? Does it mean that you still have food and water that you can consume? Does it mean that you don't have to leave your home? Does it mean that you're healthy still? Does it mean that you can predict your weather more effectively, right? For people like you and I, it might look like one thing. For somebody whose livelihood depends on steady, predictable rain patterns, like somebody in the agriculture sector, their story of adaptation could be much more dire. In my mind, we are going to have a tough conversation when it comes to funding adaptation, not just because we were falling so short of it, but I think a lot of it too is going to be difficult to monetize in the same way that we might be monetizing mitigation. And that's just something that I think as a growing pain of the sector, we're going to have to realize that different types of capital, different types of return mindsets, and obviously different types of innovations are needed to meet these goals.
Jamil, thank you for walking us through the report. There's so much meat in there. We, of course, only scratched the surface, but really appreciate you elevating some of the insights and these recommendations. Let's switch gears now and talk about a couple of the other initiatives that you're driving. Let's start with Riffle Ventures. What is it and what are you focused on at the moment?
Riffle Ventures was something that my co-founder, Suma Reddy, and I put together as a concept roughly a year ago. The vision was there's a role for more intentional venture building, but at the same time, there needs to be a lot more advisory work with governments, foundations, funds, et cetera, in building what we would call climate tech or climate innovation ecosystems. And for the past year, we did a lot of kind of research and brainstorming and trading ideas with friends and colleagues just to get a sense of when we say venture studio, for instance, or we say ecosystem, what is that? Does it register in people's minds? What does that make them think of, et cetera? And we went to COP28 almost as a bit of an experiment. We got asked to speak on a few panels. We convened a few panels, gave some presentations. I really had a wonderful time. And I think emerging from COP, we realized that one, a lot of the same questions we've been asking all of last year are getting asked all around the world, right? What are the models that can expedite innovation? When we say ecosystems, who needs to be involved? What are the most important relationships? How do you incentivize people to collaborate, et cetera? All these questions are still getting answered. I think what we're realizing is that, and the reason why the ecosystem piece is really important to the venture building piece is that we still need to be able to meet the market where they are. So we can't just go out and start building venture studios around the world because it's still a young asset class. A lot of people don't understand it. A lot of businesses are still trying to figure out how to do it, us included. So we have one company that we're building right now as our first kind of test case. It's called Gather. It's an agriculture robotics company. These have been invested in by Elemental Accelerator and supported by a couple other accelerators. And we are kind of a part owner and developer of it. In parallel, the advisory work is really exciting. I mean, we've got a small group of clients that we're working with. And in a lot of ways, they're asking very similar questions, but they're also at different stages of their maturity in answering those questions. So for some clients, we're helping them to develop new thought leadership around how to build more agriculture innovation in a particular region of the US. For other clients, we're actually setting up new studios or venture builders with them in their country. So it's a wide kind of ranging portfolio for now. I think it'll probably stay that way for a while. I think that within the next year or two, we're going to start moving into developing a fund. But for now, we're really enjoying being this, I mean, for lack of a better word, a bit of a Swiss Army knife when it comes to working on climate tech. And it's been a lot of fun so far.
Fantastic. Another part of the ecosystem to support innovation, of course, is training people. And last year, when you appeared on the podcast, we talked about your climate tech bootcamp. And I see that you're back in action. Tell us about the bootcamp, who it's for, and how it's changed since we talked about it last year.
Thank you again for giving us that spotlight because it was really helpful as we were getting it off the ground. The first 3 cohorts we ran, I go back to use this word, it was very experimental, where there's obviously, as you said earlier, a lot of demand from people to work in climate. What we found was that we're better at working with people that are trying to build companies. And so at first, it was a bit of a come one, come all mentality. If you wanted to build something, we'd love to talk to you and have you. If you wanted to just find a company to work for, we'd love to have you as well. The 3 programs that we're going to be running this year are in collaboration with a really interesting organization in Atlanta, Georgia called OHub, Opportunity Hub, founded by a gentleman named Rodney Sampson, who's a kind of a thought leader when it comes to building inclusive startup ecosystems. And we're working with Rodney and his team with some funding from the government to run what we're calling these pre-accelerator programs with an angle towards identifying opportunities to launch climate tech startups or grow them in the state of Louisiana, which is one of the most climate vulnerable states in the US. And I think for us, on one hand, it's a proof point that our model has demand. It hopefully has impact as well. I mean, we're still early in the game. But at the same time, I think we're realizing that it's needed across the board, right? Like, it's one thing to have a fund or an incubator program. I think we're really enjoying being able to catch people at a super early point in their company building experience. It's a lot more fun for us because the idea is very malleable. There's a lot more room for creativity then. And I think it's something that we want to be taking into other countries too. So we're exploring opportunities to implement in a couple markets outside of the US, which we're really excited about. And the other thing that I'll add is that because we're partnering with OHub, the funding that they've received to implement these programs with us has investment accompanying it as well. So we'll actually get to start investing in companies that we run through the pre-accelerator, which is another exciting milestone for us.
Fantastic. Well, what else is in your portfolio that you might want to elevate or something that you're not getting to work on, but oh man, you wish that you had time for?
Couple things. I've been really enjoying, and it's been completely by chance over the past year, just a growing number of roundtables and speaking engagements. So opportunities like this, but also doing it more publicly at places like COP28 or giving private presentations to executives or government officials. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting about this, and I talk about it with Suma a lot and my other colleagues, is that it's really remarkable how difficult it is, no matter how smart the people are that we're talking to and working with, to wrap their head around what the full spectrum of climate risk really looks like. Because as soon as you start to feel comfortable understanding what the level of risk looks like, you realize that you've probably missed about 10 other risks that are not as apparent. So on one hand, it's just been fascinating to see how everybody is kind of globally going through this process of still learning what a world dealing with climate change looks like. And I've been doing some advising to different governments on this issue as well. And it's remarkable how we're all in this educational phase still. The other thing that I think has been really exciting is that there's, and it gets back to the talent issue, which is something that I think we want to start digging into more in Riffle, is that if you think about it, over the past couple of years, yes, a lot of new climate jobs have been created, a small percentage of them are very, very influential leadership roles, right? So chief sustainability officers, climate czars, heads of climate corporations and governments, et cetera. So people that have remarkable amount of decision-making power to allocate resources. These are new jobs, right? That the world has not really seen before. And a lot of these people, they're super talented, super sharp, but they're also stepping into a very, very difficult mandate, right? They're basically being tasked with make the company green, right? Make the country resilient. We've never asked people to do this before. Something that I think we're very excited about doing, it's also a very daunting task, is being able to work with some of these larger entities over the next couple of years to help them think through their strategies to build resilience at the national level and the firm level. And there's definitely a role for investing, but there's also a lot of a role for capacity building and education, which Suma and I are really excited about. So those would be some of the areas that I think in particular that get me most excited. The last is I think we're expanding our agenda in emerging markets, which I think we're not talking about enough. So at COP, we were part of a group called Innovate for Climate Tech. It was created by Mustar City, COP28, Tencent, and a group called the Catalyst Fund in Dubai. And so it's this platform to support climate tech solutions in the global south. And so we met a lot of really awesome entrepreneurs and investors and policymakers and scientists that are thinking about the global south. And we're really excited to both not just build new programs with them, but create new knowledge with them, if that makes sense. And that's something that I think is going to keep us really energized for quite a while.
Jamil, so great to catch up. Congrats on all of the progress. Keep going. Keep working on all these different threads. It's so important and great to see you. Best of luck.
Thanks so much. And right back at you, Jason. I love what you do, and it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.